My name is Jeff Sugg, and I am a projection designer. And we're here today to talk about the creative process. Now, of course, all designers go through similar creative processes, but what I want to talk to you here about is some specific things for us projection designers, and then a little bit about how those interact and overlap with things in other disciplines as well. The most obvious thing, perhaps, about projection designers is that we work in image, and what I've found over the years is that that can really become a difficult thing to work on within a production. It's very easy for large projected images to overwhelm or compete with what's happening on stage. And I find that that's not really useful, right? It is our job as projection designers to help further the intentions of the text, of the director, and of the project as a whole. So it's really not in our best interest to try to show how bright or how large or how fast or how interesting our imagery can be. We really need to be working in service to the entire product. And so sometimes that means that our projections need to be still instead of moving. Sometimes that means we need to be using color fields only, or maybe it needs to be monochrome and desaturated as opposed to full color. There's all sorts of ways to attenuate the brightness and the intensity and the presence of imagery as it relates to the larger production. But it's really important that we as projection designers are mindful of the power that these images that we put up there can have, and the damage, frankly, that they can do to the production. So I think it's really a great way to start this by just reminding that we are in service to the whole show. We are one piece of the puzzle, and by no means are we the most important piece. And with that, we'll get into it. Okay. So the 4 sections of this creative process that I thought are useful to talk about are research, and that's, of course, from the initial development of the ideas all the way through showing it to the director and gathering all of this stuff together to get our initial thoughts and aesthetic decisions made. And then storyboards, which become useful as we start to take those ideas and turn them into content, figure out how to work them into and make them interactive pieces of the show. The next thing is content creation. So obviously we'll take whatever versions of storyboards and research that we've done and then begin to make full-scale content for the production itself. And sometimes those things stream one from the other, and it's very easy to take the research images and turn them into content. But sometimes it's a little more difficult, and you need to go out and find fresh stuff altogether. And like, I prefer to just go ahead and shoot that stuff or create it from scratch for the content for the show. And then the last thing is what I call creating on stage. And that's when you get, sometimes in the rehearsal room, but most frequently onto the tech period and then into previews, where the entire production is working together in the same room to create the piece. And that's obviously when things are very exciting. You're also moving at a very quick pace. So there's certain adjustments that you need to make and certain ways that you can facilitate working your craft inside of those parameters. For projection designers, sometimes what we do takes a very long time, so it can be very important to adjust the ways in which we do that to facilitate a smoother tech period. It's like, for instance, rather than having a whole room wait for you while you render 3 minutes of video, you could render 12 seconds and show the idea, get that up there, see if it works, and then go back and do the 3 minutes later, right? So it's these sorts of things that we'll talk about in that section. All right, so let's get going. First part of research is reading the text. So most of the stuff that we're going to be talking about is assuming that you have a text to begin with, whether it's a play or a musical, but it's a piece that you aren't making in a sort of devised way in which everybody is collaborating in the same room the whole time. That's a very effective and dynamic way to make work, but it's not what a lot of us experience in most of the theater that we do. So we're going to kind of stick with the text-based idea and the construct of that for this lecture. So as you're reading a play, it's important to kind of think about the themes in the same way that you would for a book report or something, but you want to get those literary ideas down so that you understand what the playwright is trying to get out there, what the important aspects are that you're going to want to be able to highlight. And as you sort of come to understand the themes and the arc of the show, it'll help you find the points of transition, it'll help you find the points of transformation, and it'll help you to understand the way that arc is moving throughout the play or the musical. And then there's some sort of pragmatic things about place, right? So frequently projection designers are relied upon to help define the space, define the time, define the season. All of these things are really vital pieces of dramaturgy. So as you're going through the script, are you inside, are you outside? Is it fall, is it winter, is it spring? These types of things, seasons in particular, are very easy to show with imagery. Are there buds on the trees? Is there snow on the ground? All that kind of stuff can be very, very useful for telling a story. And also time of day, daytime, nighttime. Time of the actual date. What year is it? Is it a period piece or is it a contemporary piece? So all this type of information is there in the script. It's vital to get it all down. Start making your scene breakdown so that you're aware of where everything is and how the flow goes. And that's going to really make it easier for you as you get into the research. It'll drive the research that you're looking for, and then it'll also help you make the content. In addition to those things, you're going to want to see if there's any practicals required. So in the same way that the lighting designer is looking for lamps that need to be in a room or chandeliers or practical lighting effects, we also want to know if there are any practical video effects. Is there mention of television sets or LED walls? Is there mention of cameras? Are you expecting to have live feeds of performers projected into the room or onto screens or onto TVs? These are all very pragmatic and important things to get a handle on for the design and for the budgeting, but they also have larger, influences outside of just that. For instance, the play I did called Sweat, the script called for several specific newscasts and sporting events to be on these TVs that were dispersed all around the bar where the play took place. And those helped to keep the audience aware of when it was and where it was and what the news of the day was, right? So these were things that were important for the dramaturgy, but that weren't expressly being written about in the text itself. They fell onto me as the projection designer to get that information and to relay it to the audience. And then if you're working on things like pre-recordings, right? So do you need pre-recorded footage of actors that will then be shown in the play? Are you using live cameras? All of those sorts of things, especially the pre-record, has very long-ranging effects on the things around you, right? So it becomes an issue of planning because you need to shoot those things outside of rehearsal hours sometimes. It becomes an issue of coordination because you'll need the stage manager to help you get that time. You'll need to deal with costumes, hair and makeup, props, maybe even scenery to help dress that set and the actors. And then you'll want to make sure that those costumes are the same costumes they need to be in the show, if that's in fact what you need. You don't want to shoot an actor in one costume and then find out 3 weeks later that it's all been changed to a different costume entirely if it's supposed to relate directly to what they're wearing in the show. So that's important in that sort of organizational situation. And then once you kind of have a handle on the text, then you can start doing more research. And so that's going to get you to sort of the large, basic visual ideas and aesthetic notions. you want to start collecting things that speak to you in relationship to the text. Images, books, films. I love paintings, going to museums, finding specific painters whose aesthetic or whose mood speaks to the piece. Because then you have a catalog built right in with all the various paintings of that painter and how they've expressed those things. Even songs, poetry, other forms of text can be useful because they'll express moods in ways that maybe the script doesn't, but are also similar ideas. Pretty much any of those types of things that you find inspiring and will help you to convey the ideas that you have onto the director as you start to talk about more what you're doing for the piece. I also just included an image here of a file directory that I used for Tina and research. And this was just the visual research, the images that we collected. But it's all laid out there in these folders, and I just put it there as a reminder that it's important to stay organized as you start going through this stuff. Especially in projection design, you will be working with so many images, so much content, so much storage space necessary. So the more organized you can be about where things are and how you're filing, the easier it's going to be for you and then for your team as they come in. And then if the show has a longer life, you'll have more team members maybe coming back in a year or 2 years later, and they'll need to be able to understand the organizational system as well. So once you've kind of got this larger idea research done, that can also then feed in to start developing palettes, right? So I like to take a thing that I first learned about from costume designers, and they make these mood boards. And those mood boards, when I first experienced them, were for individual characters. They would have a sheet of paper for each character that said, here's the colors they like, here are the patterns that they like, here's some hairstyle pictures, here's some costume pictures of clothes that they might wear. And it kind of gave you a rough look at what that character would be from a costume perspective. So I've kind of taken those ideas and translated them over to projection. And those can be made in Pinterest boards, or they can also be done by hand, just printing out images that you like, making a collage, a pastiche of something that represents the show as a whole, or more specific ideas, or even scenes, or, like in the case of Bring It On, a musical that I did about cheerleaders in high school. There's sort of all of these scenes that took place in the high school, but there was a whole different set of scenes that took place in competitions. And so were these two separate worlds, both of which needed a cohesive and well-defined design idea. Similarly, in Tina, the musical, it was important for us to kind of remember that this was a dream play, right? So the whole play takes place in the 7 seconds between when she is about to go on stage and then finally does go on stage for this big performance. And so that was a very important thing to be able to keep in mind to develop the visual motifs and what I like to call the visual narratives for the show. And it's, the questions are, what story do you want to tell? What do you want the audience to remember? How do you want to relay that information to the audience? And now that you've got the sort of reference images and the color palettes and the texture palettes, you can start to get into more sort of cohesive images that start to talk to the spirit of what you're looking for. These images that you see here are 6 different stills from actual cues from Tina that ultimately all fell into this same sort of image narrative, the motifs that we'd set up to help remind the audience that it is this sort of dreamscape. And some of the characteristics that we liked were this blurry imagery and this sort of out of focus distance and a depth of field that I didn't really frequently see in theater projections. Smoky transitions so that we can use clouds and smoke arrays to come in and out of these things from scene to scene and let everything feel fluid and connected and all coming from a similar world. And then a lot of light flares so that you could use the light to fade from one place to another, so the sky could white out and crossfade from one scene to the other. And these all became really useful ways to go from place to place, but to also remind the audience that it was one cohesive idea that we were working with. Okay, so that gives us a lot of information about research. And the next section up is storyboards. What we're going to start here with is the idea of pencil sketches and how those might work. I really love sketching in pencil. It's the easiest, quickest way for me to get an idea onto paper. You'll see here two examples of that. One from a play that has yet to be produced, actually, called Jack Absolute Flies Again. And it's a multi-screen, multi-surface production. And there are a couple dogfight scenes within it, airplanes battling in the sky. And so you'll see there just some basic drawings of the pathways of the planes and the movements of them across the screens. On the right is some sketches from the Tina Turner musical. And it's basically storyboards of image sequences, still sequences that would show you the movement of shapes on an LED wall. And these are just basic ideas that I'll sometimes show to a director and often show to my animators so that they'll have a sense of what we're working on. Another way to go through things is to simply do more fully rendered still renderings and to give you a sense of the fuller look within the scenic setup. And frequently we'll get set drawings from the scenic designer team, and then we can use those and place our content on top of that. Very useful for conveying information about scale, placement, size, and really giving a very rough idea of what it'll look like. I find that these can also be very problematic because you never accurately portray the way that these images will look within that scenery, right? So this is never actually a good representation of real life. So it's important for you to manage expectations of the director in particular as you show these things, and remind everyone that these are tools to use in order to get an idea of where we're going. These aren't exact replications of what you'll be seeing on the stage. And then after you've got these still images, it's very frequently useful to go ahead and then turn those into moving image sequences. So similarly, these can give false impressions because, again, they're graphic representations on a computer. They aren't actually, real-life full-scale mock-ups. So it's hard to tell what they'll really look like. But these are super useful in showing to people to give them an idea of how it's going to look in the space or on the set particularly. And I think we have here a moving version of this, right? So you'll see that we've got these planes moving across the sky. There are multiple screens around the theater. And what this does is it gives a sense of the movement between the screens and the way it's going to feel inside the theater. You can also do more three-dimension friendly versions of these where you can do them from different perspectives in the audience. So maybe from the front row and then from the back row in different sides, so you can get a sense of how these operate from various perspectives. Because that's also very important. How is this content going to look from different places in the theater? So now let's start talking about content creation. We could fill hours and hours discussing all the various permutations of this topic, but what I really want to touch on are some of the essential elements in the development. We obviously began talking about content creation when we discussed research, as that becomes a very basic building block on which everything else follows. But I want to focus on the tools that we have available and some of the techniques that I've found are useful as we move forward through this stuff. So in the same way that you're going to go look at research for places, you're going to start needing to find these images that you'll use for the actual content itself. Some of those can come directly from your research images. Others are going to need to be found in different places, sometimes because of resolution, sometimes because of availability, often because of rights issues. Remember that if you're going to use browser searches, you are finding images that are almost always owned by other people. So I'm not necessarily interested in going into all the points around ownership and licensing and fair use and how that relates to your production and your work as a designer, but it's very important to be aware of that. And I found that if you do end up using image searches and browsers, it's also very important to track where those images come from. So if they do end up being used in the content, you're able to make sure that you either are using licensing or that you find a replacement that's free. Pinterest, Flickr, all those sorts of things are very, very useful. Places like the Library of Congress in the US is a very huge collection of imagery, a lot of which actually is fair use and can be used for content creation. So places like that are very useful. Archive.org also houses the Prelinger Archive, which has a lot of old American films and public announcement films and stuff like that from the 50s and 60s. And those are also free for use and can be very useful. As far as stock footage, which is something that you'll frequently have to get in one way or another, there's loads of sources out there with varying degrees of quality and varying degrees of expense. Some of those are listed here: Getty, Pond5, Shutterstock. Video Blocks is a sort of, I would call it a low budget version of a stock footage place, but what they do have are a lot of very basic things. You can get a subscription, an annual subscription there that gets you access to these things, and then you can use those basic things again as building blocks for your content on top of them. Adobe is also now bringing out a lot of stock that's available through their apps, and then there's individuals out there, like I go specifically to Mitch Martinez, who's a DP in Los Angeles, who has built his own stock portfolio, and then you can buy that and use that stuff and work with him about pricing if that's an issue. So there's a whole bunch of opportunities out there, and again, different degrees of pricing, different degrees of quality, but always useful to kind of keep in mind these resources. I find that stock footage can also be useful in mock-ups and in storyboards, even in the complementary versions that have watermarks. So you can get that stock footage, stick it in your mock-ups just as a reference, and then know if you need to go back to purchase that for the production. You know, as far as the best way to make content, that's completely up to you. I personally prefer to make stuff as much as I can. You know, it gives you complete control over the product and what you're getting. It also just, for me, it's more fun, you know? And that way, if you want to maintain those visual narratives that we were talking about earlier, you can make sure that all of the techniques that you're using for the shooting kind of fall within the same world. You know, on some level, I'll just use these resources for a communication between me and my animators, so that I'll take photos or make small mock-ups that then they can use. Some of them actually end up being used in the show, or some of them are references so the animators can then reimagine those ideas and make their own content. So what are some of the ways to do this, right? So I found that creating my own sort of stock footage catalog is the best way to do this. And for me, that involves using all of the resources available. That's my phone camera, my point and shoot camera. If I've got my nice video camera around, you can use that as well to shoot footage. And all those things can then be cataloged away and used later. Just as a hint, I always found that it's useful to shoot things for longer than you think you will need them. Add an extra 30 seconds for whatever shot you're making, because it's always useful to have that extra footage. And then as you start to gather all this stuff, it's really important that you stay organized in the same way that I suggested you stay organized when you're gathering research. This sort of stock library is just that, a library, and so you need to be able to categorize the images, describe what they're shooting, and then to group them together so that you've got everything filed away in a very, very useful catalog. I've accrued over the years terabytes of footage, and some of it's really well organized and I get to it and use it easily, and others of it is, you know, sitting on my phone and I'll never get back to it because I didn't take care to organize it as I was going. You know, and it's important to just kind of figure out what's the best way for you to organize things. For some people it's a FileMaker project, for others it's Airtable or just a straight up spreadsheet. Some people just make folders on Dropbox, and it's really important, I think, to keep an eye on your fellow designers and see how they do it, and find a system that works best for you. That's because that's who ultimately it's going to be for, you and your team. So what I wanted to show you here was a whole bunch of individual videos of small pieces of content that I've made. You see an ink drop, you see some light being shown through a prism, you see a kaleidoscope of some lines, and then more food coloring and milk, you know. So these are very kind of lo-fi, simple things that I shot, all with the intention of manipulating and then reusing for this piece called Flower Power, which was a new composition by Julie Wolfe that was done at the Los Angeles Philharmonic. So here you can see an image of it in performance, and those are some of the ink drops that we did, but manipulated and changed and then turned into kaleidoscope images and used on these giant screens, right? All of that footage was shot with my phone, but then put through Premiere and After Effects and turned into these larger things. Similarly, this is image of just light shooting through a prism that we then remanipulated and used for this purpose. So now I wanted just to give you a little example of a piece of media that I made for Bring It On, a musical I did several years ago. And this kind of shows you the journey of the content from its inception all the way to the stage. So several sequences from Bring It On are competition sequences, and they include large searchlights, you know, like you would have at arenas or things like that. And so I was at a baseball game and I noticed these lights and I thought they were really a great representation of what we wanted to use. So I took a photo of those lights and then I sent it over to my animator and we started taking that apart, right? So we cleared out all the surrounding stuff, cleared out the people, and we're left with just the light units themselves and some of the baffling, but the little pieces that made that sort of situation what it was. And then we put that into After Effects, and as you'll see here, each of those individual light fixtures were given their own light source within After Effects so we could control the glow and the brightness of each of those things. And then we started adding some various lens flare effects over the top of that, right, to emulate a camera that was using. And then each of those things now became animatable points with keyframes throughout the content. And so all that work then comes to this content in the end. And so the base structure was that photo that we used, but with all these additions and manipulations, we were able to turn it into something that was much more controllable and much more dynamic for use on the stage. I just want to take a quick second here to also just show you a very brief example of some green screen shooting that was done also for Bring It On. And mostly I just want to show you this as a reference for what you would need to get a good green screen shot. You know, this was a screen that was probably 4 meters by 6 meters, and we were able to wrap it around here. And then we had a bunch of Kino Flow lights to light both the screen and the performers separately. You know, chroma key effects in general are a very, very powerful tool. Here it's obviously being done full body with performers that would then be turned into footage with whatever background we choose. But it's also useful in tabletop, tabletop versions when you're just shooting smaller objects, and then you can scale those or use them however you need to. I just once again want to take the opportunity here to point out that in order to do this shoot, we needed communication with stage management to make sure that we had access to the performers and the schedule and the time and the space. We needed costumes and wigs and makeups to be on board so that they all had the right stuff, the right costume for these sequences. And we also needed to make sure that the timing was done in such a way that those folks had time to prepare, right? You can't plan it for the beginning of the rehearsal process necessarily because all those costumes aren't complete at that point. You can do preliminary shoots and stuff that you can use as reference for yourself and for future shoots and stand-in footage, but you generally want to do the final shooting closer to tech so that the costumes have been checked on stage and everything is sure to be how it will be for the rest of the production. That kind of leads us to a discussion of some software, and this slide will be irrelevant in 2 years, I'm sure, but it's just kind of important to note that stuff as it's a powerful tool within how we create this content. And this is very much up to each individual designer and what their desires are and intentions are, but it's also to note at some point the content that you're working on will be passed between other people, right? So you'll be sharing the files with your animators, potentially with your programmer, with other designers. So you need to be mindful of what type of software you're using to do these manipulations, and does it need to go back and forth to other people. That gets into larger issues of versioning and all that sort of stuff, which isn't really relevant here. But it's kind of important that as you choose these different softwares to use, you need to make sure that it's stuff that's going to be able to be used throughout your team and maybe beyond. The sort of standard at this point is the Adobe suite in two-dimensional work. Photoshop, After Effects, Premiere, and Illustrator are all vital tools. Final Cut Pro is still used in some worlds, and Avid also you'll find is used for editing. And then some people use Resolve, not just for color correction, but also for editing. In the 3D world, Cinema 4D and Blender, I find, are the most commonly used pieces of software for that work. Maya is still out there and was a very powerful tool for many, many years. Notch has become a much more frequently used piece of software, and a lot of that has to do with its direct relationship to the Disguise media servers. So not only is it a useful tool for content creation in and of itself, but the way it speaks to Disguise makes it a very powerful tool for quick and easy workflow back and forth between those two platforms. SketchUp can be used, and then more recently people are turning to gaming engines to create 3D environments like Unreal and Unity. And this stuff is also very powerful tools that can make huge impacts on content development. And that's kind of the basic structure for what we've got out there for software right now. There's a lot of options, and again, it's really important to find the ones that are useful for you and your team that allow you to easily and quickly create the content that you're going to need. That takes us to creating on stage, which is the fourth part of this lecture. And I use this term as a way to talk about the specific processes around working in the room. And for me, that starts with rehearsals. Now, there aren't a lot of circumstances in which you're going to be able to bring technology and content into the rehearsal space. That is really a technique that's pulled more from the experimental method for creation, very common in devise work, but it's a really great way to see the content early as it relates to the show. It's also a wonderful way to collaborate with the other designers and the performers, and it allows you to have the content being developed at the same time as the text. Now, a lot of people in more traditional theater structures aren't familiar with this technique, and so there can be some growing pains associated when you're trying to collaborate with others and manage the workflow of this type of thing in the rehearsal space. But it's a very productive and powerful way to experiment, and ultimately you'll find that you're more fully integrating the media elements into the dramaturgy of the show, into the show as a whole. Another way to do this early on is to create specific workshops that are about media integration. And so this was a musical piece called The Demo by Michael Rouse and Ben Neal, and I co-designed this with Jim Finley. And we had a huge workshop here that allowed us to play with the screen layouts. It allowed us to play with the live camera integration, and it also let us start taking our content and putting it next to the dramaturgy of the show. And because it was a musical piece, we could hear all the music, listen to the arc of the music, and start developing a more thorough relationship between the imagery and the staging itself. And in this particular piece, the music had already been completely developed. So we had a full score that we could work with in these workshops. All right. That takes us to working inside the models. So there's a couple examples here that I want to talk about and ways to do this. The image that you see here is actually the 3D model inside of the Disguise media server for the Tina show that I've done. And as you put your content into that and you have all the set elements in there, you can start to see how your content relates spatially to the scenery. And then you can also take photos of this or do outputs that you can share with the director and other designers, so you really have a full model representations of what you're doing. And here are some versions of a different way to do that. So this was, again, Bring It On. On the left, you'll see photographs taken of the model from the scenic designer. So these are the scale models that he made and his team made. And then we took those photos and then photoshopped in our content so that you could see it inside of that. On the right here, you see a production photo showing you the end result of that. So in this particular instance, there's a lot of pretty significant overlap. So it looks like we got pretty close there. Here's another slide from Bring It On. Again, on the left is the model with some photos photoshopped into it. And then on the left, or on the right, is the final product from the production. I think this, you can see how the imagery developed quite a bit to have a much stronger relationship with the lighting in the room, and also to help express the dynamic nature of the vertical lines in the space. There's a lot of horizontal lines already in that set, but it was nice to add these vertical elements to sort of make the space feel larger. And then that gets us into the tech and preview process, right? So here on the right, you'll see a picture of the tech table set up for Tina when we brought it to Broadway. And, you know, again, every designer is going to choose to do this in their own way. And it's important that you figure that out as you're going along, and it'll become clear what works for you and what doesn't work for you. So I'm by no means saying that these are the answer to everyone's problems and this is the right way to do it. I'm just sharing some of the solutions that I found to work for me and my team over the years. You know, we've been doing all this talking about prep and research and storyboards and all that, and hopefully what that means is that you're coming into the tech process with a lot of material. What I've found to be the case almost without fail is that very little, if any, of those initial ideas make their way into the show at the end. So I found it's really a good idea that regardless of how prepared I am for tech, and believe me, it's really helpful to be prepared and to have content ready and to have some options ready. But no matter how prepared you are, you're going to be changing things and having to work very quickly throughout tech, and if you have a preview period, throughout that period as well. So it's important to have some techniques at your hand and ready to do that. And I found that being ready for those changes and being quick to execute them is really useful. And for me, what that does mean is if you have first versions, it's a good idea to come in with second and third options too. And sometimes that's as simple as taking a color image and changing it to monochromatic, or taking a moving image and making it a still, or taking a moving image and making it a very slowly moving image. But all of these sort of options are great ways to take what you see and to quickly manipulate it as you get into the space and all the design programs are working together, so that you can have a way to quickly react to what you're seeing on stage. And I think it's important to also share these ideas back and forth with the director and with your other designers and amongst your own team, so that everybody feels entitled and empowered to toss some ideas out there and see what happens. You know, it's important to get past the first ideas and the second ideas and the third ideas, so you can really find the way to best integrate the projections and the content into the show. And I think it's also important to try anything. You know, there were many years in my early career when I was already judging ideas before I'd said them. And I think it's very important to be able to say what you think is a bad idea, get it out there, let other people react to it. You never know what that's going to inspire in another person in the room. And so it's really vital to kind of keep the flow of information and the flow of ideas going, so that you can keep moving and get to that better thing. Here's a couple examples of some content and all the different versions that came out to make a single cue. So this is for Tina, and we were trying to get the essence of Nutbush, Tennessee, where she grew up, and what it was like there, and how in some ways it was green and lush, in other ways it was barren and dry, always hot and humid, but also remembering that we were in a dreamscape, and we had to kind of get that across at the same time too. So this is all for one cue, and each of these different variations has slightly different, you know, some of it was more blurry, some of it was more defined, some of it was more green, some of it was more blue. And all of these ideas were slowly working towards the things that we got to in the final production, which is this image, which was sort of integrating all of those ideas that we discussed earlier about the blurry imagery and the smoky transitions, and letting us really remember that this is a memory play, and these ideas are inside of her mind, and we're not fully rendering anything as if it's really happening right now. Here's another version of an end of Act 1 exterior that we were working on, and you know, you'll see just slight changes in color, changes in perspective, changes in clarity and focal depth. And then what we ended up using here was a kind of pared down version of several of these images. We took a lot of the actual clarity of space away and left these vertical lines that were columns, and then had this very blurry in the distant out of focus section that was across the street. So those are just a couple ideas of the way that content will develop over the time during tech and previews. And I think, like I said, it's important that you have a willingness to get out there and to try new things, and to experiment with everyone else in the room, and to really keep working and keep stretching to find out what's going to be best for the show. You know, you never know what those ideas are that really are going to tell the show, tell the message of the show in the best way. So it's really great to kind of keep a fluid, collaborative spirit alive in the room, so that everyone feels like they can really help make the piece what it needs to be.